Most people think clarity makes change easier, that once you see what needs to shift, the next steps become obvious. That clarity creates momentum, but there's a space people don't talk about as much. You recognize the pattern, you understand why it's no longer working, and instead of movement, there's hesitation. Because knowing what needs to change isn't the same as being ready to change. And that's usually where the real question begins. In the last episode, we talked about what happens after you leave something that no longer fits. But what happens when you haven't left yet? Even though you already know what you need to do, you're still in it. That job that doesn't challenge you anymore, that relationship that feels more draining than supportive. The way you're eating, resting, managing stress isn't working for you. And you can feel it. It's no longer right for you. There's no denial there. You've already done that part. You've recognized the pattern. You understand why it's no longer working. So now the question becomes, where do you start? How do you start? What do you actually do with that knowing? We'll come back to that. But for now, this is the part that people don't expect. Knowing what to do doesn't actually make it easier to do it. There are moments where this really becomes clear. Imagine someone sitting in their car right before work. They haven't even gone inside yet, but they already feel tired, not physically, just a kind of mental heaviness. They know exactly why. The work isn't fulfilling anymore. They've outgrown the role. They've thought about it. They've talked about it, maybe even made a few small plans. So the awareness is there. They're not confused. And yet, pay attention here because this is the part that is very easily overlooked. They still put the car in park. They still walk inside. They still move through the same routine day after day after day. Not because they don't know, but because acting on that knowing would change more than just their schedule. It would change their routine, their identity, their sense of stability. And that's a far bigger step than it seems for many people. And that's where this starts to make sense. Awareness and action start to separate because awareness expands your options, but action requires you to give up something. There's a concept in psychology called loss aversion. I'm going to say this slowly so that it really sinks in. It suggests that people are more sensitive to what we might lose than what we might gain. So even if something isn't working, it's still familiar. Your brain understands it. It knows how to operate within it. Change, on the other hand, even when it's positive, removes that structure and introduces uncertainty, the unknown. And the nervous system, well, it doesn't immediately register that as growth. It registers it as risk. So even if you clearly see what needs to shift, you can still feel the resistance. Not because you're incapable, but because your system is trying to keep you within the formula it recognizes. Even if something better is possible, your system still asks, what am I giving up to get there? And that's a fair question. But that question can slow everything down, sometimes more than we expect. It can even bring things to a full halt. There's also the role of repetition. Patterns aren't just ideas, they're practiced responses. They've been reinforced over time. So when a moment to act shows up, your system doesn't default to what's new. It defaults to what it already knows. And that's why awareness doesn't immediately translate into movement. And once you start looking at it this way, you begin to see how common this space really is. Not just in one area of life, but across all of them. In relationships, someone knows they've outgrown that dynamic. They can articulate it clearly, and yet they adjust themselves again and again because leaving would mean redefining who they are in that space. And that takes more than awareness. In how we take care of ourselves, you might know you're carrying too much stress. You can feel it in your body. You've noticed the signs, the tension, the fatigue that doesn't really go away. And still, you keep the same pace. You say yes when you are already stretched too thin. You push through even when your body is asking you to slow down. Because slowing down would mean changing patterns that have been there for years. And that's not always easy to interrupt. In work, you might know you're ready for something different, but stepping into that difference means letting go of what's predictable, even if it's no longer fulfilling. And so you stay, not because you don't see it, but because the next step requires more than recognition. And across all of these, the pattern is the same. You can see what needs to change and still feel the pull, the gravity to stay with what you already know. And when you start to see that, it becomes a lot more personal. And that's where this starts to matter a little more because it can feel frustrating. I know what I need to do, so why am I not doing it? And it's easy to interpret that as hesitation or a lack of discipline, really. But if you look at it closer, it's often the same pattern showing up in a different way. The same pull towards what feels familiar, the same resistance to what feels uncertain, just expressed in different areas of your life. So the question shifts again, not just what needs to change, but what is this pattern still providing that makes it hard to leave? Because most patterns don't continue without a reason, even the ones that no longer serve you. They offer something: stability, predictability, a sense of control, familiar roles. And that's what makes this more complex than it seems. Because when you think about changing it, you're not just moving towards something new. You're stepping away from something your system has learned to rely on. And that's not always a clean switch. You can see that something else exists beyond this. And that possibility holds potential. But potential on its own doesn't change anything. It just sits there, waiting. And across all of this, there's tension between what you understand and what you're ready to do. And that's often the part that feels the most frustrating because the tension is where most people find themselves, but it's also where things begin to shift. And when you're in that space, the question is no longer, why haven't I changed yet? It morphs into, what am I doing with what I know? Because awareness is the beginning. It's you opening the door to something different. But stepping through that door doesn't happen all at once. It happens through practice. And that's the part that often gets overlooked. We spend time learning, thinking, reflecting, understanding. But how often do we actually practice what we've learned? How many times have you read something, understood it, agreed with it, and then never applied it? But knowledge or understanding on their own doesn't change behavior. It just sits there unused. And over time, that can start to feel frustrating because now you're not just unaware, you're aware and still not moving. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. So you're not alone if you're saying, I know what I need to do, but I'm not doing it. Not because you're unwilling, but because action asks for something different than awareness does. It feels like a bigger step than awareness has prepared you for. It asks for repetition, for small shifts, for stepping into something that doesn't feel natural yet. And that's a very different skill than simply recognizing the pattern. And that realization usually changes how you see everything after it. So in the beginning, it usually doesn't look like a big decision. It looks smaller than that. Saying no once when you normally wouldn't. Pausing before responding the way you always do. Choosing something different, even if it feels unfamiliar. Not changing everything at once, just interrupting the pattern one moment at a time. Here's your sip of the day. Awareness shows you what's possible. Practice is what makes it real. If this channel has slowly become a part of your routine, has become a steady place for you during the week, you're always welcome to subscribe or leave a comment about what resonated with you today. Those small things help this conversation reach someone else who might need it. And if you ever feel like supporting the channel more directly, there's also a donation option. Or you can pick up something from our shop linked below. But mostly, I'm just glad you're here. If you're already starting to move, or even thinking about it, the last episode on what happens after change might be a helpful place to go next, or maybe the Unbecoming Uncertainty in the Unbecoming series. So to wrap up, if you find yourself in this space, seeing the pattern clearly, knowing what needs to change, but still feeling that hesitation, it might not mean you're stuck. It may mean you're right at the point where something is asking to change. Not all at once, not immediately, just differently, even if it's small. Clarity doesn't always create movement. It just shows you the door. And change? Well, that only happens when you begin to move toward it. If this resonated, you can continue the conversation here, or just sit with it for a bit. What do you already know that you haven't started practicing yet? And next week, we'll close out the Shoreline series because once you see the pattern and understand why it's hard to leave, there's still one more question left. What does change actually look like when it finally begins? I'll see you there.